Don't remember.
That's what we have it here. That way I can see where you scoot around. Middens.
Middens, yes.
So she's going to drop this.
You found it?
We're not sandals.
I think it was on Mastodon, phones and stuff.
Refrigerator was still over this way.
That was a long time ago.
What's that?
I said it's a good short image.
Yeah.
Could be.
I think we're gonna do well if I can get this pointer working.
So that was it, and then eventually we got married.
Right.
Lived happily ever
Okay, so at the end of the program, when they got there.
John?
after.
As a result of the expected move to Boston.
Yeah. And then he did something very nice when they decided to stay in Israel.
I'm not sure that that's what it was.
I could just like signal.
Yeah, I think that's what
That's what I thought, but
at that time, Jerusalem and New York
wasn't there. Oh, the ghost. The ghost did it.
Upside down. I'm going into the corner, sorry, I'm going to whisper quietly.
Just slide out for a second. Hey, how are you?
It'll be just a couple of minutes, John.
Yeah, no, no rush. No rush.
Yeah.
Hey, Frank,
Can
how are
somebody
you?
hand me that box of masks right there?
No.
Hey, how are you? Good to see you.
Margaret?
Yes.
This is my neighbor John.
Hi, John. Nice to meet you.
Actually, it's Bob.
Bob.
I sometimes call myself John.
Do we have another John?
You have to be John to come to this presentation.
And if you're not a John, you have to leave.
I'm just kidding, but I'm John and he's John.
That's right. We're all John.
He's John.
You're
And there's a couple other Johns who are gonna help us.
John in that room back there.
I'm lucky enough.
You're KB.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Good name, John.
That's all right, man.
What's your middle name? What's your middle name?
Charles.
John Charles. Okay.
Did we make anything out of that?
No. What's your middle name? Right, common name?
I think at a certain time, people were interested in print.
Right. That's how they were limited to how many seats that they had.
You don't remember?
Ada.
Ada.
Names, I remember, but I can't picture. Was she a member here or Ada?
And her middle name is Elizabeth.
Is anybody, hi, I'm John Phillips, I'm the naturalist here, and I'm gonna do an introduction in a second, but, hey Carol. So, is anybody too hot? Do you want me to crack the windows a little bit, or is it comfortable
No,
for you?
it's comfortable. There's two over here.
Alright, does anybody need a mask? We're requiring masks. Okay, I'll be right back.
Hi, how are you?
You can come sit here.
There's another seat up here if someone wants it.
Welcome to the Dogan Point Nature Center. I already introduced myself. I won't introduce myself again. We've got some of our, this is the Lower Hudson chapter of the New York State Archaeological. I'm going to put my mask back on when I'm done talking. This is the Lower Hudson chapter. This is the headquarters of the Lower Hudson chapter of the New York State Archaeological Association. We're one of 16 chapters statewide. And you know, get some information and join if you're interested in archaeology, because it's a great group of people and we do some interesting stuff. I apologize for the state of the Nature Center right now. It's recently been under construction. You'll see some odd things. If you use the bathroom, you'll see a crazy looking thing in the bathtub. That's a brick mold from a site nearby, a brick yard that's soaking so it doesn't fall
I was
apart.
wondering what
It's
that was.
150 years old. It's kind of scary looking, but it's just an old brick mold. And then like out front, you see all these square white blocks of stone that have been rolled away from the construction equipment that was coming in and out. That's all Sing Sing marble, which was used for the Underhill Mansion on the southern tip of the point, which was built in the mid-1800s and quarried in Sing Sing, probably by the prisoners, because they used the prisoners to quarry the Sing Sing rock to build the prison with. And it's actually a pretty high quality marble. And I found it in the woods and got it back up here and had it all laying out. And then they were rolling over it with the construction vehicles, so piled it up there. So that's why that's some of the disarray and the explanation thereof for that. Anyway, John Garbellano, I've known him now for, I don't know, 15 or 20 years? No.
Pretty much.
A few years. He's a very enthusiastic, very knowledgeable student of archaeology, and he's doing a lot of research up at the State Museum in New York, and he's also doing a lot of field work, including right nearby, about, what do you think, 3-4 miles
3
north
miles,
of here?
yeah.
3 miles north of here, in what's called George's Island Park. It's another county park, just like Dogan Point Park. And I won't steal any of his thunder. I'll just say he's been working up there, and it's great to have him in the neighborhood putting some stuff together.
Yeah.
He's seeking his doctorate at via SUNY Albany in conjunction with the New York State Museum, and it's a great pleasure to have him here. John Garbellano.
Thank you everyone for coming here. Your days off and everything. I appreciate it. I will leave my mask on for the discussion. But I just want to take a minute to recognize that we are on the ancestral land of Algonquin-speaking people in this part of the Hudson. We would still be in Stockbridge, Muncie, Mohican, a little bit of Delaware, Lenape. So I just want to recognize that we are on land of descendants who are still in this area. Some of them are in other parts of the Northeast and other parts of North America, but much of them are still present. And if all successful, I'll be able to reach out to some groups and see how interested they would be in collaborating with this project. For me, this is going to be a discussion about Hudson River estuary shell middens, and as the introduction went in the pamphlet that you may have seen posted, I'll be talking about interactions with other resources along the Hudson River as well, especially in relation to how people adapted to rising sea levels and other circumstances. I'll be talking largely about the research that I've proposed to John in Westchester County and my dissertation committee. And I'll essentially just be reading a paper. I'm just going to cue you with like, I don't know, I'll just cue you when it's time. With that, I'm just going to start reading to you guys. And if you have questions at the end, feel free to ask them. So without further ado, in the last few decades, archaeologists and other scientists have improved our understanding of shell middens and their significance in relationships to human ecosystem interactions with coastal and terrestrial ecosystems. Through the emerging study of human ecosystem interactions, archaeologists have helped show the profound history of shell middens that go back at least 165,000 years, and they're linked to the spread of Homo sapiens around the world during the late Pleistocene and Holocene, and the relationship with the stabilization of global sea levels in the early Holocene. In the Hudson Valley, the paleoenvironment picture is still vague, thus we still have a limited understanding of ancient human ecosystem interactions in this area. Although there has been some important work that has illuminated aspects of pre-European history and culture in the Hudson Valley and extending regions of coastal New York, what has been accomplished to date is limited in scope. So we know that sea level rise for the last, sea level rise rose at a rate of around 3 to 4 meters every 1,000 years, from around 6,000 to 4,000 years ago. And then it slowed down to about 1 meter for every 1,000 years for the last 3,000 or so years. But we still know very minimal about people's actual interconnected relationship with this ecosystem itself. And with the exception of Dogan Point, many documented shell midden sites in New York are poorly known, studied, or published on. Many dates for shell fishing fall between 5,500 years and 4,000 years ago, but most of these dates are only reflected of 2 sites which you may have heard of, Dogan Point and Piping Rock. How archaeological work is conducted on Hudson River shell middens is extremely important, as there are remaining Native American communities to collaborate with in initiation of excavation, analysis of artifacts, and most importantly, the preservation of their culture and tangible cultural remains, such as burials or other symbolic areas that were sacred or profane. Most of the work that has been completed in my study area has been done in the last century or so by Mark Harrington, Dr. Mary Butler Lewis, Lou Brennan, which you're all familiar with, and Dr. Cheryl Clausen, which some of you may be familiar with. Brennan and Clausen investigated, their investigations produced at least almost 20 dates of oyster shell from Dogan Point. But between the two of them, they really only dated shell and charcoal. They didn't date other things like bone. There's only one antler date. So they have this long list of dates that go back from 300 years to upwards of 7,000 years ago. But it's primarily dated at 2 other sites. And then a lot of the other sites in the Hudson Valley are just based on archaeologists' interpretation of the material remains that we're finding. People like William A. Ritchie, Robert Funk, which some New York archaeologists, some of you might be familiar with. So my own research will build upon the work of these previous archaeologists and their excavations, using an approach that is exclusively focused on chronology, but my bigger question is how important were specific resources to the Native Americans along the Hudson River. So for this proposed research project, I will address the question of how important Hudson River estuary resources were to early archaic period peoples, subsistence, and other practices. And to find out how important, you can go to the next slide. It might be the space bar.
Yeah.
And then go again.
It's a space bar. There you go.
Yeah. You can go to the next one, actually. So to sort of answer this large general question, I have to ask smaller specific questions. What impact did early people have on the Hudson River estuary, particularly in the context of the area's larger environmental and cultural processes? As I mentioned, through periods of rising and stabilizing sea levels, these were, in a single lifetime, you could have seen like rapid changes to your environment. You could see sea levels come, dramatic events. The technical term is the hypsothermal event, which was a period where sea levels stabilized and the climate was a bit more temperate. So I'm looking at information around that type of climate change. Are there changes in shellfish practicing during these periods? Do we see more use or less use of certain resources, not just shellfish, other fish and other things? What, if any, variations exist between technology and subsistence or other resource practices? And what type of ideological influences may have influenced people's interactions with different resources? So these questions are critical in addressing changes in people's actual relationships with the Hudson Valley and the Hudson Estuary. And learning how important resources were to ancient people actually has broader implications concerning our view of the Archaic period, which has sort of been glossed over. There's been a lot of influence on the Paleo-Indian period, a lot of interest in the Woodland period and sort of European contact period, but the Archaic period in this part of southeastern New York is sort of, not a lot of attention's been given to it. Robert Funk and other archaeologists focused a lot on western New York, and only a little bit of attention has been given to certain parts of this part of New York. So you go to the next one. Some researchers consider the global proliferation and appearance of shell middens all part of this sort of revolution and evolution of people during the widespread development of agriculture. One group of scholars argues that humans have long had this sort of local and regional effects on Earth's ecosystems, but some of those effects did not take place on a global proportion until the last century. Others sort of argue that humans have always had this long impact on certain ecosystems, and this idea of there being a pristine ecosystem where these gardens of Edens don't exist. Humans have, largely wherever humans have gone, we've had an impact on our environment, good or bad. So the paradox, though, as great as shell middens are, because they're just these giant, almost time capsules of information, they've also been overlooked for many years within this discussion of human-environment interaction. And it's now only recently, with this emerging scholarship of people who are more focused on biology and ecology, that we're starting to pay more attention to what shell middens can tell us about people's interactions with resources, both terrestrial and marine or aquatic. You go to the next slide. So the descendants of the large group of Native Americans who inhabited the Hudson River estuary and Hudson Valley over the last 7,000 years and longer are still in this region. I would hope, I'm planning on reaching out to some of these groups, and I've primarily just been communicating with the Stockbridge Bunsey and the Delaware tribe, the Lenape, but they're primarily in New Jersey and sort of around the Chesapeake Bay. But I'm reaching out because one of the things that previous archaeologists didn't really do is collaborate with these groups. So for me, part of my training, trying to follow through with some best practices and just be very ethical about my approach. I don't know if I'll run into any type of burials or other things that would put this project on hold. So for me, it's important to have them a part of the process, get their insight and perspective on what I'm doing. So that's one of the things I'll be doing during this project. Go to the next slide. But oysters themselves, the last couple of years I've been kind of called the oyster guy. And as much as I'm looking at oysters because there are these keystone species that can filter the entire Hudson River in a matter of days, and they create all this biodiversity, they help bring in other species, and they're really good for the quality of the river and other species that are in it. But that's not my only focus, even though they have broad implications for things like conservation and cultural heritage. But they are the main cultural signature we see of the last 7,000 or 8,000 years of people's interactions along the Hudson River. So what's interesting too is that oysters in the Northeast, the Hudson River, was actually one of the major industrial producers of oysters for the whole world. And there's this great book by Mark Kalansky called The Big Oyster, where it takes you on a large deep dive history of oysters from European contact even to Native American use of oysters. And it's just a great book. He also wrote a book called Salt, and Cod, and a few other books. But when Europeans arrived in this region, oysters are actually one of the first foods introduced. You go to the next slide. First introduced to Henry Hudson and his crew, and the Dutch immediately learned how to harvest oysters the way that the indigenous peoples of this area were. You can go to the next slide as well. So they use these massive tongs that could go down a few meters to go to the substrate and just pull the oysters straight up off the reef. In certain areas, you could just walk out when the tide goes out and go to the oyster reefs and just pick them up. But some of them are beneath the tide, so you have to use other technology like this. And I haven't figured out how old this type of technology is, but I haven't come across anything preserved in the archaeological record. But beyond this, and you can go to the next slide, there's other forms of, there's other forms of technology that signal sort of interactions and adaptations with this environment, whether it's net sinkers or ulus or bonefish hooks and other types of technology that we see in later and earlier periods. They let us know sort of what that interconnectedness with their environment was like in this area. So, and it's also evident because of these shell middens that people did have a lasting effect and created noticeable changes to their environment. Some of these shell middens, Dogan Point, if anyone's ever been out there, it's several acres of just millions of oysters. And even around Croton Point, if you walk the parks, you'll notice shell below your feet. It just feels like you're stepping on stuff and it's just crunching. So they're massive, and with a lot of the research that's been done, we don't know a lot about their size or internal structure, how big they are. But I will be getting to that right now. For the last few decades, anthropologists have done a lot to develop theoretical approaches to examine the past and acknowledge processes operating at all these temporal and spatial scales. And in an effort to combine all this knowledge, we're coming up with really unique ways to look at the past. During one of the first professional archaeological surveys of the Hudson River, Dr. Mary Butler demarcated this transition from oysters, use of oysters in the lower Hudson, when you're more in the estuary, to where it changed to more river. It turned into the use of mussels. So that was interesting. William Ritchie sort of noticed that as well, but Mary was working in the Hudson Valley almost a decade and a half before Ritchie was. And she felt like within 2 field seasons, it would take her at least 20 years to figure out more about this place. You can go to the next slide. Lou Brennan was the other major influence for this type of research in the area. He had about a 3-decade-long career, and he worked at a lot of the archaeological sites or shell midden sites in the lower Hudson, and he thought this was one of the best places in the entire Northeast for people to be gathering resources and meeting and exchanging knowledge or trade. So you can go to the next slide. And then there was a brief hiatus from about the mid 70s and 80s to the late 80s. Cheryl Clausen came to this area out of Harvard on an NSF grant, and she decided to revisit Dogan Point and some of the other sites in this area to see what Lou Brennan had done and see what else she could refine and improve in terms of an understanding of these ancient human interactions with the Hudson. She was coming from this more well-developed and I would say critical school of thought where people were focused more on ecology, and they had this sort of historical ecology theoretical approach, which was a lot different than sort of this normative approach that people researchers like William Ritchie and Lou Brennan had, that was just looking at the pottery and the points and sort of thinking that represented people, where pottery and points don't represent people. All the other material evidence that's there, whether it's biological or other forms of cultural evidence, do. So she was coming with sort of a more broader, well-rounded approach and training. Lou Brennan wasn't a professionally trained archaeologist, he was just navigational, but it's through his work that we have some of the most information on these sites in the lower Hudson Valley. So with that said, a lot of meaningful work has been done over the last century or so. Unfortunately, shell midden research has waned a lot in these decades. Cheryl Clausen finished her research in '95, and there really hasn't been any type of shell midden excavations or investigations since then. A lot of it's just through cultural resource management. But it's important that research like I'm doing and other students are doing throughout the Northeast, it's important we continue that because it helps us answer more how, why, and when questions about people's interactions with their environments and each other. So on top of Dogan Point, you can go to the next slide, I believe, the next one. Right. So on top of Dogan Point being one of the oldest shell-bearing sites in the Northeast, it's the most well-studied in the Hudson River. There's been several decades of research that have taken place there, but we still know very little about its site boundaries and internal structure, even the age. The dates that have been measured at this site are on a limited number of oysters and oyster shells and charcoal. Virtually none of it's on bone. So there's more to be done there and sort of more to be realized at this site. There's also new techniques and methods that have been developed in the last 30 or 40 years that archaeologists are using that are way better, not better, but let's just say some of the archaeologists that were working with Cheryl at Dogan Point didn't really know how to do a ground penetrating radar survey at the time or magnetometer survey, so that's very clear in the notes when the guy's saying, I don't really know what I'm doing, but these are the results I got. So if I have the funding and the time, I'd like to go back there with some other equipment to try and figure out what's beneath the surface and sort of define the site itself better. But there's other methods I can use that won't be as expensive, like a pH survey. Because one of the things that's cool about shell middens is they're made out of calcium, the shell. And over time, that calcium leaches into the soil. And in New York, we have very acidic soil. And what these shell middens do is preserve what's inside under the ground. So like bone and other things that will decompose is often preserved at these sites. And with a pH reader, I can just put it in the ground and I can sort of know where the pH in the acidity is off in certain areas. You can go to the next slide. So this is my proposed study area. You can hit enter. So right now we're actually here, Croton Nature Center. This is Haverstraw Bay area, and you can't see, it's distorted, the sites, but all of these boxes have the names of shell midden sites in them. This is Liberty Island, and there's a shell midden actually on right near the base of the Statue of Liberty that's over 1,000 years old. And there's other sites throughout Long Island, and this is going to be the other area I'm looking into that Mary Butler did research on. It's in Tivoli Bay, and I'll be permitted to work at the Goat Island and Kruger Island sites there. So this just gives you a rough idea of where other shell middens are along the Hudson River, and I'll be returning to this figure towards the end to sort of tell you how I've been tying all my research together to develop this like pattern of really early interactions with the Hudson River and some of our more recent interactions with the Hudson River over the last few centuries. My specific, you can go to the next slide. Going back really quickly to just tools and what they say, and material evidence, what they say about people's relationships. This was a utilized flake that John Phillips actually found after Hurricane Sandy, I believe. It's massive, and it's at the New York State Museum. It looks like it could be some type of preform almost, or it could just be a utilized flake. You can go to the next slide. So my objectives are to improve our understanding, this long understanding of the human environment interaction in this area, and to improve the chronology of this area, so we can focus more specifically on people's uses of different resources along with shellfish. Deer is something white-tailed deer and other mammals are one type of resource that's found at a lot of these sites. But because of some of the techniques that early archaeologists used, like Lou Brennan, unfortunately, it looks like he just went in there with a shovel at times and just shoveled and didn't really screen. He used like 1/4-inch mesh most of the time, and sort of did this block excavation, which was way different than what Cheryl Clausen did. She did like by arbitrary levels at like 5 to 10 centimeter intervals, and she did really fine screening. So going back, you can go to the next slide. Going back and sort of getting a better understanding through more refined techniques. So these are just 2 shell middens. I put them up here to sort of give a example of how important, I guess, shell middens were to people, or shells themselves and some of these resources were. This is the Garbellano shell midden in Maine, I believe, and it's like the largest shell midden in the Northeast. But much like shell middens in the Hudson Valley, throughout the Northeast, a lot of them have been destroyed over time because they've used the shells to create lime and to build houses and create roads and all these other things. So it was once the biggest, and now it's through time, through people being people, we destroyed it. Here is a shell midden. You can't really see it because it's distorted, but this is a project that Torben Rick at the Smithsonian was working on in the Chesapeake Bay area. He's like one of the experts on shell midden, and not even just shell midden, just human interaction with terrestrial and like aquatic ecosystems, and I've been looking at a lot of his research. You go to the next slide. But the sources of data that I've been using, it's like cooking. You use what you have, right? Sometimes, and what I have at my disposal are a lot of extant museum collections that Lou Brennan collected and Dr. Butler collected. This right here is everything that Lou Brennan and Cheryl Clausen collected from their excavations at Dogan Point. It took me over a year to catalog an inventory at the New York State Museum. But within that, found a lot of interesting artifacts, and then that led to me learning more about this woman, Mary Butler, who I'd love to answer questions about afterwards if anyone knows about her. During her surveys, she did quick expedient surveys all throughout the Hudson River, and she found really interesting evidence of adaptations people had. We see a net sinker here. We see an ulu, part of an ulu, which actually has history that relates to the Arctic and Inuit peoples. It's used to cut meat, seal meat, or fish meat. And I believe that one came from Kruger's Island, or Goat Island, which is more in a river-like system of the Hudson, rather than the estuary. So I think that just sort of signals things about like their mobility and just their interactions with different parts of the Hudson River, but I'm going to be looking more into that. It's definitely a sign of aquatic adaptations. You go to the next slide. So I'll be using museum collections, but I'll also be using bulk samples and materials that I've excavated. I'm trying to really pair, trying to work harder, or not harder, trying to work smarter, not harder. So I'm using extant museum collections, so I save myself a lot of time excavating because everything's contingent on time, resources, money. So I'll be using museum collections, but I'll also be using things that I've recovered from working at Dogan Point and other sites. And like I said earlier, one of the issues with previous archaeologists is they did this big block excavation where sometimes they didn't even put their backfill back in, and they didn't screen. So things that I would like to do are, and you'll see my grid soon, target test some of these areas again where things may have been overlooked. When Cheryl Clausen revisited Dogan Point, she was finding things that Lou Brennan overlooked. I'd like to test the back dirt piles that exist at this site to see what else may have been overlooked. The most important evidence for me is sort of the biological stuff that's been left behind, fish bones, other evidence, whether it's fish bones or mammals, things like that. Even seeds could potentially find evidence of early horticulture and other interactions in this area. Go to the next slide. So what this diagram shows is a site map of Dogan Point. You can enter. This red rectangle represents the area that Cheryl Clausen felt future archaeologists should work in. These squares represent, or test units represent, the areas that Lou Brennan dug in. And as he explains it, he essentially went to Dogan Point and just dug straight up through the heart of it. And when Cheryl Clausen got here, she did test unit and shovel test fit excavations, almost like made an L. She just went westward of where Lou Brennan went, and she target tested in some other areas. These rectangles right here represent that geophysical survey I said that was completed. Her crew member didn't really know what they were doing, and I looked at the geophysical data, and it's just a mess. The way the guy was taking his readings, there's a lot of evidence that there's too much disturbance and he didn't really know what he was doing. You can enter. But yeah, I'll be working westward of that site, and there will be another slide that shows you the actual areas I've worked in so far. But I'll be using a total station to go out to the site and try and establish a new grid. It's tough to find the old grids that Cheryl Clausen and Lou Brennan worked on because the site is literally eroding into the Hudson River. That's another broader implication that this project has for the future. It might be possible in later projects to determine how much of the site is being lost at an annual rate. So that's something I like to do. I want to map the site and create new maps of it. But I'm doing this sort of quick, expedient approach, and you can go to the next slide, from using bucket augers to go down at arbitrary like 10 or 20 centimeter intervals, and I'm just collecting everything within that column, and I'm going down until I don't find shell. And I did all of this work this summer. Walk in, walk out, carry everything in a book pack. Tough, grueling work, especially when you're working by yourself, but it's helping me delimit site boundaries and just like evidence of where the shell is and where it isn't. And you can see, you can't really see, but this is, I'm 40 centimeters down, and you can see shell all the way at the base, and it kept going. In some areas I'm finding shell go 80 centimeters below surface, and others it's just right at the top. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so yeah, so hit enter please. So you can keep hitting enter. Yep, again. So these are the transects I set up, and I think there's one more. And you can just keep hitting enter. And I took bucket auger samples at like 10-meter intervals, and I did that across the entire site, or the grid that I'd established this summer. And my plan is to go into the lab this winter, sort through everything that I took, and analyze what I found, and that's good right there. And then what I want to do this spring and summer is do smaller interval testing in areas where I'm finding stuff. And then I also want to go into the other areas of the site that haven't really been explored by previous archaeologists. You can go to the next slide. And as I mentioned, if contingent on funding and other time and resources, I want to bring geophysical equipment out there to see how useful it is at shell Middens sites in this area even. But there's other simpler techniques that I can use as well, like pH survey, and even, like I just mentioned, target testing with bucket augers. You can go to the next slide. And after this summer and next summer, I'm going to be doing all this artifact identification and analysis. I just actually received the Robert Funk Robert Funk research grant, so I'll be using that funding to get a series of dates from Dogan Point and several other shell Middens sites in the Hudson Valley, start refining this chronology. This is where I'm at right now. I'm in the lab. It's very time-consuming work, but I'm taking each bulk sample bag that I've dug up and I'm screening it through wired mesh and getting everything, or the entire matrix, cleaned up to see what is there. And then afterwards, I'm going to take all of the organic or biological remains and sort of identify it, categorize it, even if it's like lithics. And then I'm going to be presenting the actual results of what I found at the SAAs this year. You can go to the next slide. But as I just mentioned, I just got the Funk Foundation Research Grant Award, and I'll be dating hopefully 8 bones, potentially more. These are examples of the samples I'll be dating. You go hit enter again. So this is just an example of a bone from Dogan Point and a bone that was recovered on Goat Island. And I'm focusing on bone because most of the dates that we have come from oysters. And there's issues with dating oysters in regards to things like marine reservoir curve and how that affects carbon. Even with charcoal, there's issues with contamination. Just earlier dates in general, there's issues with contamination, and there's corrections that we've come up with where we can refine the dates themselves and sort of correct them. But bone has been grossly overlooked, and a lot of these other dates just come off of an archaeologist interpretation where they're using like standard counting, and they're saying, well, this comes from the woodland period because it looks like this point, and they don't actually have dates for them. So coming up with new dates is really important, and using methods to learn about the chemistry and seasonality, when people were getting resources, all important for sort of updating our understanding of people's interactions with this environment. You can go to the next slide. And then my feasibility. John mentioned that we've been working on this since 2018. 2018 was very busy. We had a lot of momentum, and unfortunately COVID happened. So I lost all momentum, couldn't go out into the field, did a lot of research and writing. And there's going to be a bunch of slides here. So this is some of the field work I did in 2018, really just coming out to the sites, getting acquainted with the area. You can go to the next slide. And in 2019, I went to Penn Museum because I was doing more research on Mary Butler's life and career and work in the Hudson Valley, because Lou Brennan's really known for the work he did, but 20 years earlier, Cheryl Clausen did all this research, so that led us to going to some of the sites that she did research at, where she found shell middens in the Upper Hudson. This is right in Tivoli Bays. So kayaked out to Goat Island, which is now called Magdalen Island, with my teacher, and this woman, Mary Burns, who sort of is like a caretaker almost of the island. And we actually went to a rock shelter and a shell midden site, and we almost lined up the images perfect that were taken. And there's something I want to, it's anecdotal, but what's really cool about Dr. Butler's work, when she's the first woman to get her PhD from University of Pennsylvania in anthropology. When she was working on her Hudson Valley Archaeological Survey, she had Margaret Burke-White come out with, I don't know if you know who that photographer is, Times, yes. She took these photos, some of the photos, so like on a side project, there's this research I want to do with Margaret Burke-White and Mary Butler, like these two iconic women who were doing this research, sort of like in a man's world back then, and just coming up with just great work. Like, I could save it for afterward, but Mary Butler and William Ritchie butted heads, and she stood her ground. And had World War II not happened, who knows how much she would have advanced our research and understanding of the Hudson Valley and the Hudson River. This is us at Goat Island finding evidence of the shell midden area. Let me go to the next slide. And then this was a tour which some of you may have been a part of a couple years ago, where John and I took members of the chapter to Dogan Point. Go to the next slide. But then COVID happened, and there was a year hiatus. And then finally, John and me and my committee, we got out to Dogan Point and Croton Point, and we showed my chairs and committee members some of the sites that I've just been talking to them about for like the last 2 years. So that was really great. But then the summer came down to actually doing work because I finally got the permits I needed, and went out there, put up the grid, which I showed you, and I bucket augured every Friday and Saturday for the whole summer and took all my bulk samples. It was tough work, but I got it done, and it felt really rewarding to finally do something rather than just not doing something like I did for a year with my research. And the site's beautiful. Like, you guys came here, you can start to imagine what it would have been like living in this area and how abundant resources would have been. And it was very clear when I went to Dogan Point. I'd get there at like 8 o'clock in the morning, and you're walking up and you see foxes run by and deer and just all this life and birds. So that was really amazing. We'll go to the next slide. But there's all this significance and sort of greater implications that my research has. And it is focused on the archaeology and sort of looking at the archaic period, because Dogan Point was colossal when Lou Brennan came up with this date of almost 7,000 years, and it blew everything out of the water in terms of dates. You just hold on a second. People were like, this can't be. Like, there's no way people were interacting with the Hudson River at this point in time when all these crazy changes were happening with rising sea levels and changing forests and resources. So like, there's all that and the implications of improving the chronology and sort of like our misunderstood view of the archaic period, and all of the knowledge and technology that Indigenous people in this area had. But then there's this whole broader implication of what we can do about today's dilemmas. And that's where oysters come in again, where we're learning how they can be used to create living shorelines. I've been working with the Billion Oyster Project for the last 2 years. We've been talking back and forth. I'm mostly focused on cultural education and archaeology, anthropology component, but they're doing this really cool project where they're creating these breakwaters out of oyster shell that's going to prevent future natural disasters, or hopefully prevent the negative effects of hurricanes. But they also, there's this whole other niche area where they're creating these living shorelines where we're actually preserving eroding shore. Because what happens is, I need like a whiteboard to draw on. You plant oyster shells, and what happens is they attach to whatever's beneath the surface. And then we create these massive oyster reefs, right? And they grow atop of each other. And when the tides go in and out and in and out, those oyster beds that they're creating lock the sand. And then over time, you have grasslands and other life that returns biodiversity. And you can actually, they call them living shorelines, you can preserve and recreate shoreline that's being lost because of erosion. So for me, it's this crossroads of mixing what we're learning about the past and then combining it with the present to sort of help us with the future, whether it's site erosion and working on projects where we're working on cultural heritage, or environmental preservation, or we're just trying to see what we can learn about past interactions to sort of dictate what we do in the present going forward with the future. You all know the history of the Hudson River. People think if you jump into it, you're going to come out with like additional arms and legs and eyes. What's very cool about oysters, and I'm stepping back to them being these bioengineers or keystone species, is they've been responsible, and Billion Oyster Project's part of it, but you see projects in the Chesapeake Bay and other parts of New Jersey and Maryland and everywhere. what oysters are doing is they're pulling carbon out because they store it in the shell. They're pulling out other chemicals and other things that are in the Hudson River. They're cleaning up the Hudson River. And what the Billion Oyster Project has seen in the last 10 or so years is they're seeing this return of other species to the Hudson. And they're finding where these industrial oyster beds were exhausted, they're actually able to bring back some of the oysters that they're repopulating are actually doing well, and they're starting to thrive and establish themselves. So we're seeing this return of life, and the Hudson's not this, gross place. It's full of life. You're not going to jump in and come out a Ninja Turtle. But, so you can go to the next slide. So there's just broader implications that I hope in my career help with things like legislation, help with improving state Native American relations, help with just education in general, and just our view and perception of ancient ecosystem, ancient human environmental interaction. There's this idea again that environments were pristine, where there were these gardens of Edens where people didn't do harm or wrong to the nature and environment. And shell middens are kind of evidence that suggests that maybe that wasn't the case, but maybe there's some truth to that too. Maybe they had really controlled use. Maybe they were targeting specific types of shells or reefs, resources. Maybe they weren't over-consuming. And through the various methods I'll use, whether it's counting or measuring the size of different animals that we find through excavation, I'll sort of start to be able to piece that all together, and that'll be done through dating and other things. But there's just a lot that I'm going to be able to do with this project throughout my entire career. Let me go to the next slide. And my results. You're going to enter. You're going to enter. You're going to enter. I'm going to show you anyway. I've done a few conferences through NISA, the Council of Northeast Archaeology, and SAAs, and I've come with this perspective where I need to look at archaeology, I need to look at the history, sort of meld it all together. And I found some pretty cool patterns, I think, and maybe it's obvious that we would see these things. If you can just start hitting enter, I'll explain what I'm finding. These yellow dots represent Billion Oyster Project reefs, where we're seeing oysters take off again in areas that were polluted or pretty much polluted, or there were older oyster beds that no longer exist. These are all the sites that correspond. These purple smiley faces represent 17th to 19th century commercial fishing grounds. And what's crazy about the Hudson in this part of the Northeast, oysters in this area, when Henry Hudson came here, he recorded like hundreds of thousands of acres of oyster reefs. And all throughout the 18th and 19th century, oysters, and you can slow down a little bit, oysters were used, or they were exported internationally, and they were shipped all across the country, out to California, over to Europe. When Europe started having a crisis because they were over harvesting all their oysters from the Hudson went to Europe. And even Massachusetts, when the oyster bed started being used up, we relied on oysters from the Hudson and Long Island. So even Maryland. So there's this long tradition all throughout the Northeast of people loving their oysters. But it goes back to when Henry Hudson came here, and obviously it goes back upwards of 7,000 to 8,000 years. You can keep hitting again. What these white stars represent are archaeological sites, some of them a few hundred to several thousand years old. So I blended this all together to just create a picture of where humans have been interacting with the Hudson for the last 8,000 years. And we see a lot of overlap, and that's not surprising. People tend to gravitate towards areas that other people have gone to. But these red circles represent my sort of 3 study areas. We're going to look as far north as Albany, but most of what I found, even in terms of freshwater shell midden sites, is around Tivoli Bay, and then all the oyster sites are right beneath sort of Bear Mountain Bridge. These orange X's represent archaeological sites that Mark Harrington studied through the Museum of Natural History in 1909. And as I've mentioned several times throughout this project or presentation, there's been like no research in terms of archaeology at these sites in the last 100 or so years. So all these sites that Mark Harrington studied, there hasn't been any research. A lot of these sites that Mary Butler studied, there hasn't been any research. So for the last several decades, there's just been this massive hiatus, and it's a real shame because the Hudson Valley sort of acts as a time capsule in itself from all of the information that's been lost because of rising sea levels since the last glacial maximum. The continent used to extend 30, 40, 50 kilometers into the Atlantic, in some places more. And all of what we know about the culture and history of peoples that were here 12,000 years ago is all under the water. Even recent places as much as 10, 9, 8,000 years ago, it's all been inundated. Cheryl Clausen suggested doing offshore coring and other things in the Hudson River. But that's something I'm gonna do when I get a big NSF grant for $1 million. For now, I'm just gonna be coring sites and bucket ordering sites and using museum collections. You can go to the next slide. And that's it. I know I kind of rambled there and I gave up my paper, but there's just a lot that I can do with this project. And in many ways, I bit off more than I can chew at times, but we've managed to boil it down to what I can actually get done in the next year or two. And that's gonna happen. And I've been collaborating with the chapter, Penn Museum, New York State Museum, University of Albany. There's more people I want to collaborate, and as I mentioned too, I want to get involved with the indigenous people of this area, because previous archaeologists, that wasn't, maybe it's something they thought about, but it doesn't show up in the literature that they had an active involvement or relationship with people who are here. For me, I want to involve them. So yeah, there's a lot. I'm happy to take any and every question. And that's it. I think you can hit slide one more. This photo comes from Mary Butler's photo album. This is at the Blodgett Building in Vassar College. And when I could talk a little bit more about that. When she did her research, she had this massive grant from, I'm blanking, but she had a massive 5-year grant that was actually, she only used 2 of it because World War II happened and all the funds were deferred to the war. But she worked with high school students and avocationals, and she pretty much showed up to Vassar and had a week to prepare the kids. They went into a farm out behind the college, and she had them practice excavate and break pottery and refit it and practice drawing. And she had this sort of shoestring plan, and she did this really amazing research that maybe I can talk about at another discussion. That was just lost. It went to the State Museum and it went missing and got shuffled around. And actually, she dug more sites than Lou Brennan. She investigated, I think, 20 or 30 sites. And it was literally as simple as just hiking out to the site or going out in a canoe or a boat and just digging some test pits and moving her way up and down the river. But again, so that's anecdotal. This was in the back of this was in her photo album, and it says the end, and I think it's the perfect way to end a talk every time. So, thank you for your time.
Anybody have some questions?
Yeah.
I understood from research done some years ago by a former deceased member of our group, Hans Schaefer.
Oh, he passed away?
Yes.
Okay.
Some years ago.
Yeah.
And a delightful fellow.
I've read his stuff, yeah.
He kind of stated the nutritional value.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could remark on that a bit.
So, what's the paradox of shell middens? You know, with people, I don't think we often give them the benefit of the doubt in like how important resources were and how like people thought that oysters were kind of supplemental to the diet and you couldn't live off of oysters. And they did a nutritional analysis of it and figured out the calories and protein and this and that. But I think people were living off oysters. They were probably smoking them and or making stews out of them. And I think they were an important part of their diet and ritual lives and sort of more of they had more social importance maybe than nutritional, but they were definitely important in terms of nutrition. You wouldn't get all the protein and nutrition you get out of a deer, but anyone could collect oysters. Didn't matter your age, gender, anything, you just go down, collect the oysters, go back. And they're simple to open. Hans Schaefer, he looked at the nutrition and he looked at the chronology too. And he sort of did his own study where he created this large comparative collection of shells he found throughout the Hudson. But I think like we get distracted by oysters and we don't know everything else that's been lost. I don't think they were just targeting oysters. They were probably also getting crab and other shellfish and other fish, other plants that grow in the Hudson too would have been important to them. But all of that has disintegrated, or it's not showing up in the archaeological record, and all that's really left are these oyster shells. But we can still use these sites because they often preserve other evidence resources in the Middens because of that calcification and change in the pH that I mentioned. They make the soil less acidic, and in New York State, all the soil is acidic, so everything usually disintegrates or erodes. But there's been other studies that have looked at the caloric value and this and that, and they sort of weighted them against other species. Long story short, I think when you look at the history and sort of literature, people thought like that going for oysters was less, how do I put this? People thought that people were focused on just the big game. And like, in terms of people's intellect or intelligence, like going for shellfish was a much later development. And what we're finding is it was actually more tied into our evolution as a species than was previously thought. So the early researchers, they thought that the ocean was just inexhaustible. And we're finding out that now, after some of these naturalists and other scientists and people, that's not the case at all. We're seeing entire changes in food webs and the food chain. And oysters are a really great example of that because like 80 to 60% of all oyster around the planet have been depleted. And now we're seeing other impacts in terms of like viruses and other things that are killing them off, in addition to like sort of the impacts we've had because we like to have oysters on a half shell or oysters Rockefeller or things like that. We're seeing other implications because now we have warming temperatures, rising sea levels. Oysters can handle certain salinity and temperatures, and if you go above that or below it too much, they just won't be able to handle the environment that they're in. So it's kind of like there's a lot of anecdote, but we're seeing like impacts of our overconsumption, and now we're seeing impacts of other natural and not so natural environmental changes. You had a question?
Yes, you had mentioned that you used a bucket auger.
Yeah.
Could you describe this and how it works?
Yeah, so a bucket auger, there's so it's a cylinder, and you can get these extensions. It goes onto a pipe, it's fitted, and it has this sort of like two teeth.
Like a drill.
Like a drill, and you use this helical motion to dig down, and it sort of pulls up as you dig and twist. And it's not as good as using like a core that just you either use like hydraulic or a hammer to just push it down into the ground, and it's not using a helical motion, so it's just grabbing everything that's beneath it. With a bucket auger, you run into some issues because as you're twisting and it's going down, things are kind of being commingled within that tube. But it's great because instead of going into a site and setting up a 1 by 1 meter square grid, square test unit, and going at like excavating at 5 or 10 centimeter intervals, that takes a lot of time. With a bucket auger, you just go in, and within a couple minutes, you can get a whole column sample essentially, and from there you can analyze what is in that specific area, and you can sort of start to, through the process of elimination at everywhere you test, sort of do finer bucket augering at shorter intervals and chase out whatever you're finding, whether it's shell or a charcoal that might be evidence of a fire pit. You find other features that might be evidence of housing or anything like that, or other activities, or they're flint knapping. You find a lot of lithics. So bucket auger is really great because it's expedient, it's quick, and you can do it by yourself. I was out there the whole summer by myself doing all this work, and I don't have a lot of money to do this funding, so for me that's a great approach because it's just quick.
And it doesn't get stuck when you hit a shell?
What will happen is it'll break the shell. If you hit a rock though, all you're doing is taking it out and moving it over a little bit. So it's nice in that approach, or in that way. I have a lot of mobility with it. You know, I can, anywhere on my grid, I can just take the tape and measure and say I'm going to put a bucket auger there, and if I find something, maybe I'll open up a smaller test unit. If I find more, I'm probably going to open up a bigger test unit. So it's a way of like pinpointing things. Yeah. Go ahead. And yeah.
I have a couple of questions that I'm going to try to tie them all in.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Wickers Creek?
I am. Yeah.
So, like how there was a whole controversy, they didn't have a lot of chance to investigate before the condo.
Yeah.
Is that right, that they could have gotten a lot more information?
Yeah.
And they just didn't? I saw the report, but if something was written before they did the construction.
I think it was a village site that they ran into. I'm not sure, but the Wickers Creek is a good example of other issues there. You have development that needs to take place. You send in archaeologists, and they may find something, but the project still needs to take place, and sometimes other things dictate what's priority and not priority. I've only read the report on it like once, and I'm trying to get it back, but for some reason I can't get it on interlibrary alone. But the Wickers Creek site is one of the other really well-studied sites in the area.
I think the Historical Society of Dobbs has a copy of it.
Okay, good enough. Yeah.
The report of the findings.
Okay. Did you have another question on top of that?
So, as I understand that they would process the oysters, the villages, and at that site, apparently that was their summer site where the weather was okay, and then they would move up. In fact, I think Ashford Avenue might have been their traditional way that they walked inward during the winter, and would sort of settle, have little campsites, maybe along the sawmill perhaps. I'm not sure what I read. There's even evidence of a cave along the sawmill. So do you have, can you speak on that, on those cultural activities, and are there any things written?
Yeah.
Did anyone have enough time to interview people in the 1800s perhaps that still resided in the area?
Yeah.
And then the other thing I wanted to just say about people who have connections, when I was just looking into it, I teach anthropology as an adjunct.
Awesome.
The people who are here through those agreements with the United States were moved to places, reservations, and or even on the fringes of Canada. So I'm not sure you'd have to go over to those places to get those Algonquin.
Yeah. So where do you adjunct at? I'm just curious.
Westchester, Mercy College as well. So we were so close to Wickers Creek that I used to always engage my students on this controversy that occurred.
Yeah.
I even used I had him study it, and we did a little project
Yeah.
on.
Well, that's awesome. Let's start with Indigenous people. So a lot of the Stockbridge Muncie Mohican were moved out to Wisconsin.
Right.
They have a tribal historic preservation office in Troy. Bonnie Hartley, I think she's still the liaison there. I've spoken with her a handful of times, but she'll communicate with people in Wisconsin. And maybe, I don't think it'll be in my dissertation, me going out there and actually interviewing anyone, but anyone that still resides in the area, I'd love to communicate with and work with, to sort of get that ethno-historic research. I didn't really dive too much into my theory section, but traditional like ecological knowledge is this whole type of theory or approach that's used, and through interviews, I'd like to sort of get contemporary views of the Hudson River, and even just like economies or ties to this area in terms of like how people in Wisconsin view the river still, and just even anyone who exists in the Hudson Valley in the Northeast, how they view it. Then your other question was on
Winter, summer.
so
So,
Lou Brennan and other archaeologists have talked about how most of like, or the specific seasonal type of interactions that they think occurred, where you had people occupying the river around like March to spring, but you could get oysters and other resources year round. I think there was likely people interacting between the interior and the coast depending on what they needed, or the river itself. But people probably were staying on the interior in like rock shelter, other types of like village type encampments. Some of the sites that we see along the Hudson, this is why it's important to go actually do like what I want to do, where I'm studying the internal structure and defining the site boundaries. You could have a shell midden or a lens that's just like, I don't know, a meter by a meter, and that might just be a short-term camp where people came to the river and just, you know, grabbed a full bushels of oysters and did some hunting and fishing, and then that's where they resided, and that has preserved on the surface. Or other people have come and reused that short-term camp. A site like Dogan Point, and even if you go to Croton or Kettle Rock, there's a lot more oyster shell. And what that sort of suggests, when you have like acres upon acres of oyster, even if you go to like Manhattan, there's Pearl Street, right? That's named Pearl Street because when they were developing Manhattan, they hit a massive shell midden. Some of these shell middens that are, you know, acre upon acre sort of signal more in situ developments, like continued use over hundreds of thousands of years, and sort of like returned use. And then I think that's where you get into like more like seasonal or ritual potential, massive feasts maybe, or those are just the parts of this broader like occupational area where they were separating their living situation from where they were just discarding shells, or other resources, waste. The research of shell middens goes back to Danish scholars, and I'm blanking on the name, but the word that the Danish used essentially translates to kitchen midden, and they thought that middens were just like trash bins. That may not be the case. When you go to Maine, and you go to other parts of the Northeast and potentially out in the Northwest, I haven't done too much research there, you find actual burials in these shell middens. You don't see that, at least it hasn't been reported at any of the shell middens in the Hudson River. Maybe that is because there hasn't been a lot of research done. It could be other cultural changes. It's also period specific. A lot of these changes and interactions are practices. But in my research, I'm learning that I've learned some really cool things of the local history. Liberty Island and Ellis Island. That's called the Big Oyster and the Little Oyster. And there were historic fishing grounds for the industrial oyster fishing. There were massive reefs there. And they're called that because of in their indigenous translation, like the Native American translations for what their original names are. I've read other things about how potentially we're finding oysters in certain parts of the Hudson River because they're either found at the confluence of major tributaries and rivers with the actual Hudson, and that might signal this perception of like life and it being sort of like cyclical and like you see like the mingling of different waters. Like the actual translation of the Hudson River is the river that flows both ways or is constantly flowing. There could be other ritual or ideological things associated with shells and middens beyond just this is a source of food or other things.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about, you were talking earlier about how 7,000 years ago, there were all sorts of climatic changes
Sure.
and
Yeah.
sea level rise, and how that has implications for how we might behave today. But I'm wondering, I mean, changes are happening so much more rapidly now.
Yep.
So is that applicable, what we learned?
Yeah, so it's
yeah.
super applicable to everything. The Hudson River itself formed around 15,000 years ago when the glaciers were melting, and then I'm gonna get this wrong, and it's gonna be recorded, but like Lake Champlain or Lake Albany, when there was essentially this massive ice dam that broke and it started flooding the valley, right? And then at the Narrows in the Hudson River, there was another one that broke, and then we had this massive, all this water needed to go somewhere. So it carved out the Hudson Valley, and around 8,000 years ago, there's geologists who have done research where they bucket augered or cored through marshland, and they found evidence that there was enough salinity 8 to 10,000 years ago that would suggest like oysters and other species were in the Hudson River, potentially during late Paleo-Indian times. So there's potential that people were using these resources even before 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. Again, it's just a matter of like research bias and how much attention people have been giving to it. But to tie that back in with what you're asking, when the glaciers suppressed most of North America for like 20,000, 15,000 years ago, the ice just started to melt. And it finally finished melting up in Newfoundland and Labrador around 9,000 years ago. That created these things called eustatic and isostatic effects. I'm gonna butcher this, but eustatic, I believe, is when you have all this pressure on the land, and isostatic rebound is when all that pressure relieves. It's like a seesaw. So you had all this pressure on the land, and then that came off, and then you had an isostatic rebound, so it started to tip up. So you have some parts, like in Newfoundland and Labrador and other parts, where you have land rise outpacing sea level rise. And in other areas, you have sea level rise outpacing land rise. And that's what we're seeing down in this area. We're seeing sea level rise outpace sort of these other geological changes that are occurring. I'm not sure what the actual rate of sea level rise is right now, but we know it's going up. So like there's implications to tie in how people were interacting and living sustainably potentially for thousands of years in the Hudson River, and comparing that to how we're living now, and then sort of like creating this new type of almost like archaeological engineering where we're making shell middens and reefs and we're using this like biotechnology. I don't know, it's cool, but there's definitely ways to. You can re-say your question again. Maybe I've just gone.
Oh, no. I was just wondering because the climatic changes are happening so much more rapidly now because of human intervention.
Yeah.
So, even if humans are adaptable, but I'm guessing that 7,000 years ago, the change was slower and not visible in a single
So,
generation.
That's not entirely true. When the glaciers melted, there was massive changes occurring. If you study more of like the Paleo or Pleistocene periods, in anywhere where there was glaciers still, you had massive flooding events. Wisconsin and the Northeast, like everywhere. So within a single lifetime, you might have a grandparent or parent who remembers these periods of heavy rain or harsh winters or this or that, and they might even remember, well, the river was there and then it shifted course, and where we used to live is now inundated. That actually could have occurred within one person's lifetime, to see, maybe a meter or a few inches or whatever of sea level rise, and it doesn't take much to completely displace people. We're seeing that in New York City and in other areas. Hurricane Sandy was a really good example of how quickly people can get affected, and billions or trillions of dollars, that could in damages. And that's where like the living breakwater solution and all these other engineering projects are taking place, where we're adapting, and maybe it's too little too late. I'm an optimist. I think we can we have a lot of ingenuity, and we can figure it out. We can engineer our way out of this, but that's not to say big changes didn't occur 7,000 years ago in a single lifetime. The other thing is, people thought there was this hiatus almost where we see a lot of oyster reefs or shell middens that date to like 4,000 to 7,000 years ago, and then we see this drop off. People were actually still using oysters 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, but it doesn't appear to be at the rate that they were using them during the early Archaic or Middle Archaic. And that's probably because 3,000 years ago agriculture was in, and they didn't need to rely on this more horticulture or hunter-gatherer fishing lifestyle. But people have always been hunter-gatherer fishers, but agriculture just could handle the population increase, whereas sort of these other types of lifestyles probably couldn't. People have been using oysters for probably the last 10 or 12,000 years in the Northeast, but for hundreds of thousands of years, humans have been using them. If you go into Europe, you can find shell middens that are 40, 50,000 years old. So, yeah. Any more questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to take somebody else's. Okay. I think it's a short one.
Yeah.
You mentioned Bonnie Hartley.
Bonnie Hartley, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just curious what you'd recommend. I'm curious about what happens to cultural practices and stories when a whole people is moved to a different part of the country, especially a culture that's so connected to land. And I'm wondering if you can just recommend books or people to talk to, or.
I could get back to you with potentially specific like articles and stuff. She came out with an article a year or 2 years ago that's really informative about kind of like state Native American relations with consultation and working on projects together. She could speak better in terms of like relationships or sort of like indigenous views and stuff like that. I don't know. I'm just gonna leave. I could get your information. We could talk about that. But she might be friendly enough where if you reached out to her directly, she'd probably field a question for you. But yeah, no problem.
Before we break up, I want to thank John, and I promise that we'll drag him back here in another year or so to see where he's at with this project. It sounds like it's really going somewhere. I'm looking forward to that. And then I just wanted to say again about our amazing, great local chapter. I have some flyers here if you'd like to join. And there's also many members of the chapter, including Gretchen and Bobby and Trisha, who's working overtime.
Let's hear it for Trisha.
From Maryland. So anyway, I'll leave these flyers out front if you're interested in joining. It's really a great group of people.
Cut you off, but Carol was there at the very beginning of when I first heard about Dogan Point, and she recommended looking at piping rock, I think it was. Yeah. So Carol is a part of this whole development of this project too, and meeting John and this chapter.
Yes, and you all are inhabiting piping rock right now.
Yeah.
Because we're surrounded by.
There's a lot of secrets beneath.
We're surrounded by boxes from that site, and Carol's actually been working double overtime trying to figure out what's in them and reconfigure it. So yeah, these, and then also this is our last event of the year. We do a lot of talks like this, and traditionally the last one in December we usually do an informal Christmas celebration. So feel free to hang out. There's a lot of stuff to eat. And there's
Are there smoked oysters?
I was thinking that exactly. We should be eating oysters in a half shell. No, sorry, we didn't deliver on that.
Could I get a photo of you guys, my audience? And can I take a selfie too?
Sure.
All right.
But while you're looking at him, I also wanted to say that there's a bathroom straight through there past the refrigerator, and there's a water cooler there if you're thirsty too, with some cups. So thank you very much for coming. And say cheese.
Say all shucks. All shucks.
Can't tell with the mask on.
Thank you guys, seriously. Thank you.
Thank you.
John, I don't know if you remember me. I'm Caroline Kerman. I met you up there. Very helpful. I'm working on a book.
So we don't really send out a lot of emails, just we send out a flyer.
Great.
I
did not. That's going to be for
Do we have your email address?
Yeah.
I just want to learn more about it.
Yeah. Hey, maybe someone down there. I'm actually, so the SAH has a historical I'm a paper expert. I'm turning over a chapter for like women in archaeology. So maybe out of that, I thought I recognized you.
That's hard to tell.
So that's part of the video resources is also looking at where they're coming from. And Cheryl also research, she found out some of the stones that they were using actually came from Maine and other parts of the Northeast. So that's like, so that's like something I want to look more into. Norman's picture, obviously it's not everywhere, but I want to look more into a little bit of
They just finished all around, went on all day on Saturday, talking about archaeology and Native American areas.
Yeah, of course. Sure. And it could have been, that's later about what earlier people probably established. Well, and that's where this is. You don't focus on the chronology so much because you don't know the dates for a lot of the Yep.
Oh, hi, that's me.
Yeah. Sure.
So, I've been being in,
Hi, Caroline. I just wanted to know if you had Okay, so okay. All right.
I know a lot of
What's your name? That's it, right?
How's it
Thank you.
going?
Yeah, thank you for your time. Good.
This was great, thank you for having me to talk.
I think he wants to turn off the recording.
What's that?
Did he turn off the recording? No, it's still recording.
Stuff
I'll get this real
that
quick.
presents what